Sometimes the hardest hearts break open at the sound of a child's tears. Sometimes the most feared man in town becomes the gentlest father when someone small needs him most. In Millbrook, folks knew to stay clear of Levi Cutter, the giant blacksmith, who kept to himself. He worked alone, spoke little, and carried secrets darker than his forge. For 12 years, nobody dared approach him. Then little Josie Brennan lost her parents to fever and found herself with nowhere to go. One evening she walked right up to the scariest man in town and asked the question that would change both their lives. "Please be my family. Mine died." Everyone expected him to turn away. He always had before, but this time was different. This time, Levi knelt down, looked into her tear-filled eyes, and said something that shocked the entire town. Would a man with blood on his hands really become a father to an orphaned child? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Millbrook sat like a forgotten prayer in the vast expanse of Colorado Territory, where the wind carried more dust than hope, and the sun burned everything it touched to the color of old bone. Once this place had thrived on cattle, drives, and silver dreams, but those days had withered away like tumbleweeds, leaving behind a collection of weathered buildings and weathered souls who stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Main Street stretched barely 3 blocks, flanked by structures that leaned into each other like old friends sharing secrets. The general store's paint peeled in long strips, revealing the raw wood underneath like exposed ribs. The saloon's batwing doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the church steeple stood slightly askew, as if even God had given up trying to keep things straight in Millbrook. At the far end of town, where the desert began to reclaim what man had tried to tame, stood the blacksmith shop. A squat, sturdy building of stone and iron that seemed to anchor the whole settlement against the relentless wind. Smoke rose from its chimney most days, a steady grey column that spoke of constant work and burning purpose. Inside that shop, Levi Cutter shaped metal with the focused intensity of a man trying to forge something more than horseshoes and wagon. Wheels. He stood 6 feet and 4 inches in his bare feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out doorways, and hands that could bend iron bars or cradle a newborn with equal ease. His hair, black as coal dust and touched with premature silver at the temples, hung past his collar, and his beard covered scars that told stories he never shared. The forge hammer in his grip had been worn smooth by 15 years of honest labor. Every morning before dawn, he would run his thumb along its handle, feeling the grooves his own hands had carved through countless hours of striking hot metal. It was more than a tool. It was proof that a man could change what he was made of, one careful blow at a time. The weight of it in his hands reminded him daily that creation was possible, even for hands that had once known only destruction. Levi's routine never varied. He arrived at the shop as the first pale light touched the eastern mountains, built up the fire, and worked until the last customer had been served. He spoke only when spoken to, charged fair prices, and delivered every piece exactly when promised. The work was good, honest, and necessary. In a place where broken things needed fixing and worn-out things needed replacing, a skilled blacksmith could always find purpose. But the people of Millbrook kept their distance just the same. They remembered the day he'd arrived 12 years ago, riding a lathered horse and carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a haunted look in his pale blue eyes. Sheriff McKenna had been alive then, and he'd taken one look at the stranger and known immediately what he was looking at. You could always tell a man who'd lived by violence. It marked them in ways that never fully healed, the sheriff had asked. Simple questions with careful eyes. Where had he come from? What was his business in Millbrook? Did he have family or connections in the territory? Levi's answers had been brief and honest enough to satisfy the law, but vague enough to keep his past buried. He'd paid cash for the blacksmith shop and tools, started work immediately, and proven his worth through the quality of his craft rather than the warmth of his personality. But changing what you were on the inside proved harder than reshaping. Iron in a forge. The townspeople watched him with the careful wariness of rabbits observing a wolf that claimed to be vegetarian. They brought him their work because they needed it done, but they never lingered for conversation. They paid their bills and hurried away, mothers pulling children closer when they passed his shop, men touching their hat brims in curt acknowledgement. Before crossing to the other side of the street, their caution wasn't entirely unfounded. Levi carried himself with the controlled awareness of someone who'd learned to expect trouble from every corner. His eyes tracked movement automatically, his body positioned itself near exits without conscious thought, and his hands, those powerful, skilled hands, never strayed far from tools that could serve as weapons if necessity demanded it. Martha. Flynn, who ran the dress shop and seemed to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves, had made it her mission to solve the mystery of Levi Cutter. She was a handsome woman in her middle years, with graying brown hair, always pinned in a perfect bun, and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Her shop sat directly across from the blacksmith's, giving her an excellent view of his daily comings and goings. That man's got secrets buried deeper than old McKenna's gold. She would tell anyone willing to listen while she hemmed skirts or mended tears with precise, efficient stitches. Mark my words, someday we'll find out what he's really running from. Men don't learn to move like that from shoeing horses. Dr. Henry Walsh, the town's physician and closest thing to an educated man within 50 miles, took a more charitable view. He was a thin, scholarly fellow who'd come west for his health and stayed because the people needed him. His medical training had taught him to observe without judging, and what he observed in Levi Cutter was a man fighting daily battles against his own nature. Perhaps, he would say when Martha shared her theories, a man's past should stay in the past if his present serves the community well. Whatever demons he's wrestling with, he's doing it quietly and without burdening the rest of us. But even Dr. Walsh kept his interactions with the blacksmith brief and professional, never quite able to shake the feeling that he was standing too close to something dangerous and unpredictable. Then there was preacher Samuel Morrison, a man whose fire and brimstone sermons could make sinners weep and whose gentle bedside manner could comfort the dying. He alone seemed unafraid of Levi, though he respected the man's obvious desire for solitude. Once a month, the preacher would stop by the shop to have his horse shod, and he would speak quietly of forgiveness and redemption while Levi worked. These conversations followed a predictable pattern. Samuel would speak of second chances and the possibility of grace, while Levi would respond with non-committal grunts and careful attention to his work. But the preacher noticed things, the way Levi's hands gentled when working with a nervous horse, the precise care he took with every piece of work, the way he always charged widows and struggling families less than his posted rates. God works in mysterious ways, Samuel would say as he paid for the work, his tone suggesting deeper meanings. Sometimes the most broken vessels make the strongest foundations. Levi never responded to these gentle sermons, but he never asked the preacher to stop talking either. The children of Millbrook were perhaps the most honest in their fear. They would dare each other to run past the blacksmith shop, and the bravest among them might peek through the windows to catch a glimpse of the giant man working at his forge. But none had ever spoken to him directly, and none had ever seen him smile. Their fear wasn't cruel. It was instinctive, the way small animals recognized predators, even when those predators showed no immediate threat. Something in Levi's bearing, in the controlled way he moved, and the careful distance he maintained from others, spoke to primitive survival instincts that children hadn't yet learned to ignore. This was the world into which little Josie Brennan had been born 8 years ago, to parents who'd loved her with the fierce devotion of people who'd waited long for the blessing of a child. Thomas and Mary Brennan had run the town's modest hotel, providing clean beds and decent meals to the occasional travelers who passed through Millbrook. They'd been good people, faithful members of Preacher Morrison's congregation, kind to their neighbors and absolutely devoted to their bright-eyed daughter. The hotel itself was a two-story building with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the morning light just right. Mary Brennan had planted flower boxes under each window, creating splashes of color that defied the harsh landscape. Inside, the rooms were simple but clean, with handmade quilts and fresh linens that spoke of care and pride in their work. Josie had inherited her mother's warm brown hair and her father's gentle disposition, but she possessed a curiosity that belonged entirely to herself. Even as a small child, she'd shown an unusual interest in how things worked, watching her father repair furniture, helping her mother tend the small garden behind the hotel, asking endless questions about everything from why the sky changed, colors to where babies came from. Her parents had encouraged this curiosity, believing that a questioning mind was a gift to be nurtured. They'd taught her to read before she started school, shared their own limited education freely, and dreamed of someday sending her to a real city where she could learn from people who knew more than they did. The fever had taken her parents within 3 days of each other that past spring. Dr. Walsh had done everything he could, but some sicknesses were stronger than medicine, and sometimes death came for the good and gentle as readily as for anyone else. Josie had been spared the illness entirely, which seemed both a mercy and a cruel joke to those who'd known her parents. Mary Brennan had died first, slipping away in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, while Josie held her hand and whispered stories to keep the silence at bay. Thomas had lasted 2 days longer, fighting to stay with his daughter until the fever finally claimed him as well. Dr. Walsh had been there at the end, and he'd later told people that Thomas's last coherent words had been instructions about Josie's care. "Take care of my girl," he'd whispered. "Don't let her think she's alone in the world." For 4 months, she'd been passed from household to household like an uncomfortable obligation. The families of Millbrook were generous in their way, but they were also stretched thin by their own struggles. Children were expensive to feed and clothe, and most folks had enough mouths to worry about already. Besides, there was the matter of Josie's inheritance, the hotel, and the small savings her parents had left behind. That would require legal guardianship, and legal matters made simple people nervous. Martha Flynn had kept her for 6 weeks, partly out of Christian duty and partly because she genuinely liked Mary Brennan. But Martha was a spinster who'd never wanted children and didn't quite know what to do with one. She'd provided adequate care, clean clothes, regular meals, a warm bed, but there had been no warmth in it, no sense of belonging or permanence. Dr. Walsh and his wife had taken her for a month, motivated by genuine compassion, but ultimately defeated by practical limitations. Mrs. Walsh's nerves were delicate, and a grieving child's occasional nightmares had proven too much for her constitution. The doctor had apologized when he'd arranged for Josie to stay elsewhere, his medical training at war with his personal limitations. The preacher and his wife would have gladly made her a permanent part of their family, but they already had 5 children of their own, and barely enough income to feed them all. Samuel Morrison had prayed over the situation nightly, asking for guidance that seemed slow in coming. So Josie had learned, in the way children do, to make herself small and helpful and undemanding. She'd learned to swallow her tears when the nightmares came, to express gratitude for every kindness, and to never ever ask for more than was freely offered. She'd also learned that adults, for all their size and authority, often didn't know what to do when life presented them with problems that couldn't be solved with good intentions and hard work. The Hendersons had been her most recent temporary family, a kind enough couple with 3 children of their own, and a farm that demanded every hour of daylight they could give it. Josie had tried to earn her keep by helping with cooking and cleaning, but she'd overheard conversations that made it clear her stay was temporary at best. On this particular September evening, as the sun painted the western sky the color of old, rose petals, Josie sat on the steps of the general store with the one possession that truly belonged to her, a small daguerreotype photograph of her family taken the previous Christmas. The image was creased from constant handling and faded from exposure to light, but it showed the three of them standing together in front of their hotel, her parents' hands resting on her shoulders, all of them smiling with the easy confidence of people who believed their happiness would last forever. She'd been staying with the Hendersons for the past 2 weeks, sleeping in a corner of their kitchen and helping Mrs. Henderson with the washing and cooking. But she'd overheard them talking that morning about how they couldn't manage the extra expense much longer, about how someone would need to make a decision about her future soon. There was talk of writing to relatives back east, of perhaps finding her a place in an orphanage in Denver. The thought of leaving Millbrook, the only home she'd ever known, the place where her parents were buried, filled her with a desperation. She couldn't fully understand. This dusty, dying town held everything that remained of her old life, and she wasn't ready to let that go. The cemetery behind the church contained more than her parents' graves. It contained her entire history, her sense of who she was and where she belonged. That's when she looked up and saw him. Levi Cutter was walking home from his shop, as he did every evening at precisely the same time. His massive frame moved with surprising grace, his long strides covering ground quickly despite his unhurried pace. In his left hand, he carried his dinner, a simple meal wrapped in brown paper that he picked up each day from the hotel's kitchen, one of the few places in town willing to serve him without obvious reluctance. Everyone else on the street made sure to give him plenty of room, stepping aside or crossing to the opposite walkway as he passed. Children pulled at their mothers' skirts and peered around them with wide eyes. Even the dogs seemed to sense something different about him and kept their distance, though he'd never shown them anything but indifference. But as Josie watched him approach, she didn't see a figure to be feared. She saw something else entirely, something lonely and sad that reminded her of how she felt inside. She saw a man who walked alone every day, who ate his meals alone, who lived in a world where everyone stepped aside rather than stepping closer. In that moment of recognition, she understood something that the adults around her had missed. Levi Cutter wasn't dangerous because he was angry or cruel. He was dangerous because he was broken, just like she was. And maybe, she thought with the simple logic of childhood, broken people could help fix each other before she could think better of it. Before the reasonable fear that governed everyone else in Millbrook could take hold, Josie stood up and walked directly into Levi Cutter's path. He stopped abruptly, looking down at her with those pale blue eyes that had made grown men nervous for 12 years. Up close he was even larger than she'd imagined, but there was something in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or confusion, that made him seem less frightening and more human. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her mother's simple gold wedding ring, the only thing of value she possessed, holding it out to him like an offering. "Please," she said, her small voice carrying clearly in the evening stillness, "be my family. Mine died." The words hung in the air between them like a prayer waiting for an answer. Around them, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Henderson had emerged from the general store and stood frozen on the steps. Martha Flynn had appeared in her shop doorway, one hand pressed to her chest. Even the dogs had stopped their evening wandering to watch this unprecedented moment. Levi Cutter, the man who'd spoken fewer words in 12 years than most people spoke in a week, the giant blacksmith who'd kept the world at arm's length through sheer force of will and carefully maintained distance, looked down into the tear-filled eyes of an 8-year-old girl and felt something crack open inside his chest. The ring she offered gleamed in the fading light, simple gold that spoke of honest love and modest means. But it represented everything she had left of the family that had shaped her, and she was willing to trade it for the possibility of belonging somewhere again. Slowly, Carefully, as if she were made of spun glass, he knelt down until his eyes were level with hers. His large hands gently closed her small fingers around the ring, keeping her offering safe. "Keep that safe," he said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse but surprisingly gentle. "Family doesn't cost money." Then looking into her hopeful face and seeing reflected there all the loneliness and longing he'd carried for 15 years, he spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "You've got one now." The silence that followed Levi's words stretched long enough for the desert wind to carry away the dust from Main Street and settle it somewhere else entirely. Josie blinked up at him, her small hand instinctively reaching into her pocket to touch the simple gold wedding ring her mother had worn, the only thing of value she possessed and the only payment she could think to offer for something as precious as family. "I can pay," she whispered, pulling out the ring. "Mama said this was worth money." Levi's weathered face softened in a way that nobody in Millbrook had ever seen. He gently closed her small fingers around the ring. "Keep that safe," he said quietly. "Family doesn't cost money." The gathered townspeople began to murmur among themselves, a low buzz of voices that carried equal parts shock, suspicion, and fascination. Mrs. Henderson finally found her voice and hurried forward, her practical mind already cataloguing the impossibilities of what she'd just witnessed. "Now see here, Mr. Cutter," she began, her tone somewhere between authority and uncertainty. "The child has been staying with us, and there are proper procedures for these things. You can't just what?" Levi stood slowly, his full height casting a long shadow in the evening light. When he spoke, his voice held a quiet authority that made everyone step back slightly. "Can't give a home to a child who needs one?" Dr. Walsh had emerged from his office across the street, drawn by the commotion. He approached with the careful steps of a man trying to navigate between compassion and protocol. "Levi, I understand the impulse to help, but guardianship involves legal considerations. There are proper channels, court proceedings. Then we'll do whatever needs doing," Levi said simply. He looked down at Josie again, studying her face as if seeing her clearly. "For the first time, if you'll have me, that is. I'm not much for talking, and I don't know the first thing about raising children." Josie's answer came without hesitation. "I don't eat much, and I can help with chores. I'm good at helping." Something in those words, the eagerness to prove her worth, the assumption that love had to be earned through usefulness, hit Levi like a physical blow. He'd lived most of his adult life believing the same thing, that acceptance had to be purchased through perfect behavior and constant vigilance. "You don't have to earn your place," he said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him that he'd thought was permanently buried. "You just have to be." Martha Flynn had been watching this exchange with the sharp attention of a hawk studying field mice. Now she stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd appointed herself the town's moral guardian. "This is all very touching," she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "But what do we really know about you, Mr. Cutter? A man doesn't live in silence for 12 years without having something to hide." Levi's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he kept his voice level. "I've done my work, paid my debts, and bothered nobody. What more do you need to know?" "Perhaps," Dr. Walsh interjected diplomatically, "we could discuss this further tomorrow, when everyone has had time to consider the implications. Josie, you can stay with us tonight while the adults sort things out." But Josie had already made her choice. She moved closer to Levi, not quite touching him, but clearly claiming her position. "I want to go with him," the simple declaration sent another ripple of whispers through the small crowd that had gathered. Preacher Morrison had arrived, drawn by the unusual assembly on Main Street. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years reading the emotional undercurrents of his congregation. "Perhaps," he said gently, "we should let Mr. Cutter and the child have some time to talk privately while the rest of us discuss how best to proceed." It was a reasonable suggestion, but it also felt like a dismissal. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, people returning to their interrupted evening routines, while throwing frequent glances back at the unlikely pair still standing in the middle of the street. Levi watched them go with the wariness of a man who'd learned to expect judgment from every corner. When only he and Josie remained, he seemed suddenly uncertain, as if the magnitude of what he'd just agreed to was beginning to sink in. "I live above the shop," he said finally. "It's not much, just one room, really. That's more than I have." "Now," Josie replied with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who'd learned not to expect luxury. They walked together toward the blacksmith shop, an odd procession of one very large man and one very small girl. Levi's stride automatically shortened to accommodate her smaller steps, a consideration so natural he didn't seem to realize he was doing it. The shop sat in the gathering dusk like a monument to honest labor. The forge had been banked for the night, but the scent of coal smoke and hot metal still hung in the air. Tools lined the walls with the precise organization of a man who depended on efficiency, and the floor was swept clean despite the nature of the work conducted there. A narrow staircase led up to Levi's living quarters, a single room under the slanted roof that held a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and little else. Everything was scrupulously clean and Spartanly arranged, the dwelling of a man who'd learned to live without comfort or luxury. "It's not much for a child," Levi said, suddenly seeing the space through different eyes. Josie looked around with genuine interest, rather than disappointment. "Where would I sleep?" Levi considered this practical question with the seriousness it deserved. "I could build you a bed, maybe partition off a corner for privacy." "I could help," she offered eagerly. "I'm good with tools. Papa taught me some. Carpentry." The mention of her father brought a shadow of grief across her young features, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to escape Levi's notice. He'd become expert at recognizing pain in all its forms, and he saw in this child's face the same careful control he'd spent years perfecting. "Tell me about them," he said simply. "Your parents." And so, sitting at his small table while the last light faded from the western sky, Josie began to talk. She told him about her father's gentle hands and her mother's singing voice, about helping in the hotel kitchen and the stories her parents would tell her at bedtime. She spoke of ordinary moments made precious by memory, Sunday dinners, winter, evenings by the fire, the sound of her parents' laughter drifting up from the hotel's common room. Levi listened without interruption, his scarred hands folded on the table before him. He'd forgotten what it was like to hear someone speak of love without reservation, to witness the simple faith of a child who'd known security before learning loss. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the emotional weight of remembering, Levi rose and began preparing a simple supper from his meager supplies. He moved around the small space with quiet efficiency, his actions speaking louder than words of his acceptance of this new responsibility. "Are you sure about this?" Josie asked suddenly, her voice small in the gathering darkness. "Taking me? I mean, you don't even know me." Levi paused in his meal preparation, considering how to answer a question that touched on truths he'd never spoken aloud. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know you're brave enough to ask a stranger for help. I know you loved your parents and they loved you, and I know what it's like to be alone when you don't want to be." That night, Josie slept in Levi's bed while he made do with a blanket on the floor. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the blacksmith shop settling around them, and the steady breathing of the man who'd promised to be her family. For the first time in months, she felt something that wasn't quite happiness, but wasn't despair either. A cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found her way home. Downstairs, Levi stared up at the ceiling and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd spent 12 years building a life of careful solitude, and now he'd invited chaos in the form of one small girl who looked at him like he might actually be worth something. The thought terrified him more than any gunfighter ever had. The first challenge came with breakfast. Levi had lived for years on a diet of coffee, bread, and whatever simple meal he could purchase from the hotel kitchen. He'd never considered the nutritional needs of a growing child, and as he stared at his meager pantry supplies, he realized how unprepared he was for this new responsibility. Josie solved the immediate problem by demonstrating a competence that both impressed and saddened him. She found flour, eggs, and a bit of bacon, and with the confident movements of a child who'd learned necessity early, she began preparing a proper breakfast for both of them. "Mama taught me," she explained when she caught him watching. "She said everyone should know how to feed themselves properly." While she cooked, Levi began sketching plans for a proper bed and a privacy screen on a scrap of paper. His large hands, so confident with hammer and tongs, fumbled slightly with the pencil as he tried to design furniture suitable for a child. The wooden horse he'd carved the night before sat on the table between them, a crude but heartfelt attempt at creating something beautiful rather than merely functional. Josie had discovered the carving when she woke and had clutched it to her chest with a delight that made Levi's throat tighten unexpectedly. No one had ever treasured anything he'd made with such obvious joy. "It's perfect," she'd whispered, and for the first time in years, Levi had felt the unfamiliar warmth of pride in his work. The sound of approaching footsteps on the stairs interrupted their quiet domestic scene. Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway, his medical bag in hand and his expression carefully neutral. Behind him came Martha Flynn, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the modest living space. "Good morning," Dr. Walsh said politely. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I thought it would be appropriate to check on how everyone is settling in." Martha's gaze lingered on the wooden horse, and something flickered across her features. Surprise, perhaps, or a grudging recognition of craftsmanship. "I've brought some clothing," she announced, setting down a bundle of neatly folded garments. "The child can't very well continue wearing the same dress day after day." The clothes were clearly well made, if simple, and Josie touched them with the reverence of someone who'd learned not to take gifts for granted. "Thank you, Miss Flynn. They're beautiful." Martha replied, but her tone had softened slightly. "A child needs proper clothing, and proper food, and proper schooling." This last point hung in the air with the weight of an accusation. Levi straightened slightly, recognizing the challenge. "She'll go to school," he said simply, "and she'll have whatever she needs." "On a blacksmith's wages?" Martha's tone suggested skepticism. "Children are expensive, Mr. Cutter. There are doctor's visits, clothing as she grows, books for her education." "I'll manage," Levi interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that brooked no argument. Dr. Walsh had been observing this exchange with professional interest. Now he stepped forward with the gentle authority of a man accustomed to mediating difficult conversations. "Perhaps," he suggested, "we could discuss the practical arrangements while Josie explores her new surroundings. There are legal matters to consider, formal procedures that will need to be followed." Josie looked up from the bundle of clothes, suddenly alert to the undercurrents of adult conversation. "What kind of procedures?" "Nothing for you to worry about," Levi said firmly, but Dr. Walsh held up a hand. "Actually, it's better if everyone understands the situation clearly. Josie, what Mr. Cutter has offered is very generous, but there are laws about who can take responsibility for children. The court will need to approve any permanent arrangement." "What if they say no?" Josie's voice was small but steady. "They won't," Levi said, and the absolute conviction in his voice surprised everyone in the room, including himself. Martha studied him with those sharp green eyes, looking for cracks in his certainty. "You seem very confident for a man with no legal standing and no family connections in this community." "I have what matters," Levi replied. "I have the will to care for her and the means to provide for her needs." "And what about your past?" The question came quietly, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. "What about the questions that have followed you for 12 years? Do you really think the court will ignore all of that?" For a moment, the Room was utterly silent. Josie looked between the adults, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand, but recognizing the tension that had suddenly filled the space. Levi's hands, resting on the table, slowly closed into fists. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "My past is my business. What matters is what I do going forward." "Is it, though?" Martha pressed, her voice gaining strength. "Is it really just your business when you're asking this community to trust you with a child's welfare? When you're asking a judge to overlook 12 years of questions and silence?" "Martha," Dr. Walsh said warningly, but she was beyond stopping now. "We all know you're running from something, Mr. Cutter. We've known it from the day you arrived, and now you want us to simply trust that whatever you're hiding won't put this child in danger." Levi stood slowly, his full height seeming to fill the small room. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. "I would die before I let harm come to her." The simple declaration hung in the air with the weight of absolute truth. Martha took an involuntary step backward, suddenly aware that she might have pushed too far. Dr. Walsh cleared his throat diplomatically. "I think perhaps we should focus on the immediate practical matters. Josie, would you like to see my office? I have some books there that might interest you while the adults finish their discussion." It was clearly a dismissal, and Josie recognized it as such, but she also recognized the protective instinct in Levi's posture, the way he'd placed himself. Between her and perceived threat, she walked over to him and slipped her small hand into his much larger one. "I trust him," she said simply, looking directly at Martha. "He gave me a family when I needed one. That's all I need to know." Then she followed Dr. Walsh downstairs, leaving Levi and Martha facing each other across the small room like adversaries preparing for battle. "You can't protect her from everything," Martha said finally, her voice softer now but no less determined. "And you can't protect yourself from the truth forever. Whatever you're running from, it will catch up eventually. It always does." "Maybe," Levi acknowledged. "But until it does, she'll have a home and someone who cares about her welfare. That's more than she had yesterday." Martha studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she couldn't quite name. "I hope you're right," she said finally, "for her sake." After they left, Levi stood alone in his small room, looking at the bundle of clothes Martha had brought and the wooden horse Josie had treasured. For the first time in years, he had something worth protecting that wasn't just his own survival. The thought should have comforted him. Instead, it terrified him more than any bounty hunter ever had. 3 weeks had passed since that first evening, when Josie had asked Levi to be her family, and slowly, carefully, they had begun to build something that resembled a life together. The wooden partition Levi had constructed gave Josie a small, private space that she decorated with her few possessions and the growing collection of small wooden animals he carved for her in the evenings. Their daily routines had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Breakfast together, Josie helping in the shop until school time, afternoons spent learning the basics of metalwork, while Levi completed his commissions. She had a natural aptitude for the work that surprised both of them. Her small hands could reach into spaces his couldn't, and she had an intuitive understanding of how metal responded to heat and pressure. More importantly, she approached each task with the focused concentration of someone who understood that learning useful skills was a form of security. "You're a natural," Levi told her one afternoon as she successfully shaped a small piece of iron into a perfect horseshoe nail. "Your hands know what they're doing." Josie beamed at the praise, her face smudged with soot and glowing with pride. "Papa always said I was good with my hands. He taught me some carpentry. But this is different. More alive, somehow." Levi nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Metal had its own personality, its own moods and responses. Learning to work with it was like learning to speak a language that had no words, only heat and pressure and careful timing. Their peaceful routine was interrupted that afternoon by the arrival of a stranger, a well-dressed man in his 40s, who introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, Josie's father's brother. He had the soft look of someone who worked with ledgers rather than tools, and his clothes marked him as a man of some financial means. "I came as soon as I received word about my brother's death," he explained to Dr. Walsh, who had summoned Levi and Josie to his office for the meeting. "The roads from Denver have been difficult, and business matters delayed my departure longer than I would have liked." Josie studied her uncle with cautious interest. He bore some resemblance to her father, the same brown hair and gentle eyes, but there was something in his manner that made her uncomfortable. He spoke about her parents' death with appropriate sorrow, but his questions seemed more focused on practical matters than emotional ones. "Of course, I'll be taking custody of Josephine immediately," he announced, as if the matter were already settled. "She's family, after all, and I have the means to provide properly for her education and upbringing." "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple," Dr. Walsh said diplomatically. "Josie has been placed temporarily with Mr. Cutter here, and there are legal procedures." "Temporarily?" Thomas Brennan's tone sharpened. "Dr. Walsh, surely you can't seriously suggest that a child should remain with a complete stranger when her own blood relative is available to care for her." Levi had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now he spoke quietly. "She's not going anywhere. She doesn't want to go." Thomas turned his attention to Levi for the first time, taking in the blacksmith's impressive size and work-stained clothes with barely concealed disdain. "And you are?" "The man taking care of her," Levi replied simply. "Taking care of her?" Thomas's laugh held no humor. "You're a laborer, Mr. Cutter, is it? What could you possibly offer a child that family cannot provide? Education, social standing, a future beyond this dying town. I can offer her a home where she's wanted for herself, not for what she owns," Levi said, his voice remaining level despite the obvious provocation. Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. "What she owns? I'm not sure I understand your implication, Doctor." Walsh cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should discuss the legal aspects privately, gentlemen. Josie, would you mind waiting in the outer office?" But Josie had been listening with growing unease, and now she spoke up with the clarity of a child who'd learned to recognize adult deceptions. "What did he mean about what I own?" "Nothing for you to worry about, dear," Thomas said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Uncle Thomas is here now, and everything will be taken care of properly." "But I don't want to go with you," Josie said simply. "I want to stay with Levi." Thomas's facade of gentle uncle began to crack slightly. "Josephine, you're too young to understand what's best for you. Mr. Cutter here is a stranger who's taken advantage of your grief and confusion. I'm your family, your blood. I have both the right and the responsibility to care for you." "He's not a stranger," Josie said firmly. "He's my family now." "Don't be ridiculous," Thomas snapped, his patience finally fraying. "He's nobody. A laborer with no education, no connections, no prospects. What kind of future could he possibly give you?" The words hit their target, and Levi felt the familiar weight of his own limitations settling on his shoulders. Thomas Brennan was right about most of it. Levi was nobody special, a man with a dark past and an uncertain future. What right did he have to claim guardianship of a child when her own uncle could offer her so much more? But then he looked at Josie's face and saw something that stopped his self-doubt cold. She was looking at him with absolute trust, waiting for him to defend their small family against this threat. In her eyes, he wasn't nobody. He was everything. "Maybe I can't give her fancy schools or society connections," Levi said quietly. "But I can give her something you can't." "And what's that?" Thomas demanded. "A home where she matters more than her inheritance." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that everyone could feel. Thomas Brennan's face went white, then red with anger. "How dare you suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Levi interrupted. "I'm stating facts. You didn't come here for her. You came here for what her parents left behind." Dr. Walsh was frantically trying to restore order to the meeting, but the damage was done. Thomas had revealed more than he'd intended, and everyone in the room could see the truth beneath his protestations of family duty. "This is ridiculous," Thomas blustered. "I won't stand here and be insulted by some drifter with delusions of respectability. Dr. Walsh, I demand that you arrange for the immediate transfer of custody to me as Josephine's closest living relative." "I'm afraid," Dr. Walsh said carefully, "that any custody arrangements will need to be decided by the territorial court. In the meantime, Josie will remain in her current placement." Thomas Brennan left Dr. Walsh's office that afternoon with barely controlled fury and promises to return with legal documentation that would resolve the matter in his favor. But as his carriage disappeared down the dusty road toward the county seat, Levi found himself holding a piece of yellowed paper that Dr. Walsh had discreetly pressed into his hand. It was a wanted poster, faded and worn, bearing the likeness of a younger Levi Cutter and offering a reward for his capture in connection with robbery and murder charges. At the bottom, in Dr. Walsh's careful handwriting, was a note. "Found this in my old papers. Thought you should know someone's been asking questions." Levi looked down at Josie, who was walking beside him with complete trust in his ability to protect their newfound family. He folded the poster carefully and put it in his pocket, feeling the weight of his past settling around him like a familiar but unwelcome coat. Someone was coming for him. The only question was whether they would arrive before he could secure Josie's future. The weeks following Thomas Brennan's visit brought an uneasy tension to Millbrook, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Levi threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, accepting every commission, offered and working late into the evenings by lamplight. He was building a financial cushion against whatever legal battle lay ahead. But more than that, he was trying to prove to himself and the community that he could provide for Josie properly. The townspeople had begun to watch their unlikely family with growing curiosity rather than outright suspicion. It was impossible to ignore the change in both of them. Josie's grief-stricken quietness had given way to something approaching normal childhood enthusiasm, while Levi's grim isolation had softened into something that resembled contentment. Martha Flynn found herself observing their daily routines from her shop window with an intensity that surprised her. She watched Levi shorten his stride to match Josie's smaller steps, saw him pause in his work to answer her endless questions about metalworking, noticed the way his harsh features softened when she laughed at something he'd said. "Maybe I was wrong about him," she admitted to Dr. Walsh one afternoon when he stopped by her shop to pick up some mending. "Maybe people can change more than I thought possible." "People often surprise us," Dr. Walsh agreed carefully, "though I fear Mr. Brennan's visit may have complicated matters considerably." That evening, as Levi was banking the forge and Josie was organizing the tools according to the precise system he'd taught her, she made a discovery that would change everything. While sweeping the back corner of the shop, her broom knocked over, a small wooden crate spilling its contents across the floor. Most of the items were innocuous, old receipts, broken tools, scraps of metal. But among them was a small silver locket that gleamed in the lamplight with the unmistakable sheen of quality jewelry. "What's this?" Josie asked, holding up the locket with curious fingers. Levi turned from his work and went completely still when he saw what she held. The locket was delicate and expensive, engraved with tiny flowers that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. More importantly, it was familiar. "Where did you find that?" His voice was carefully controlled, but Josie heard something. Underneath that made her look at him more closely. In the crate, it was hidden under some old papers. She tried to open the locket, but the clasp was stuck with age and tarnish. "It's beautiful. Do you think someone lost it?" Levi held out his hand, and she placed the locket in his palm without hesitation. His large fingers worked the tiny clasp with surprising gentleness, and after a moment it clicked open to reveal two small photographs. A man and woman, both young and smiling. Josie gasped when she saw the woman's face. Even yellowed with age, the resemblance was unmistakable. "That's Mama," she whispered. "But she's so young. And who's the man?" Levi stared at the photographs for a long moment, his mind racing through memories he'd spent years trying to bury. The man in the locket was someone he'd known long ago, in a different life, when he'd gone by a different name, and believed different things about himself and the world. "His name was James Morrison," Levi said finally. "He was a friend, a long time ago." "Morrison?" Josie's brow furrowed as she tried to place the name. "Like Preacher Morrison?" "His brother," Levi confirmed, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. The implications of the discovery settled over them slowly. If Mary Brennan had kept James Morrison's photograph all these years, if she'd treasured it enough to hide it away in a silver locket, then there had been more to their relationship than friendship. "Why would Mama have this?" Josie asked, though her young mind was already beginning to piece together possibilities that made her uncomfortable. Levi sat down heavily on the work stool, still holding the locket. The weight of memory and guilt pressed down on him like a physical force, and for a moment he looked older than his years. "Your mother and James were close, before she married your father, before I became what I became. What did you become?" The question was asked with the directness of childhood, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. Levi looked at this child who'd given him her trust so completely, who looked at him like he was capable of heroism instead of destruction. How could he tell her that the man she'd chosen as family had been responsible for destroying someone else's family? How could he explain that his past was built on violence, and that even his attempts at redemption might not be enough to wash away the blood on his hands? "I made mistakes," he said finally. "Bad ones, the kind that hurt innocent people." "Did you hurt my mama?" Josie's voice was very small but steady. "No," Levi said immediately. "Never. But I hurt someone she cared about, someone who mattered to her." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelation settling between them. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust spiraling down the empty street. "Does this change things?" Josie asked finally. "Between us, I mean." Levi looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not judgment, but concern. She wasn't worried about his past. She was worried about their future. The realization hit him like a physical blow, this evidence of how completely she'd claimed him as her own. "No," he said, and meant it. "Nothing changes that. But even as..." He said the words, Levi knew they weren't entirely true. The discovery of the locket had opened a door to memories he'd kept carefully locked away, and with those memories came the bitter knowledge of exactly how much he had to lose. The next morning brought another unwelcome visitor to Millbrook, Preacher. Morrison found Levi at the forge, working with the focused intensity of a man trying to lose himself in physical labor. The preacher's usually gentle demeanor carried an undercurrent of tension that made Levi immediately alert. "Levi," the preacher said without preamble, "we need to talk." Levi set down his hammer and turned to face the man who'd been the closest thing to a friend he'd had in Millbrook. About my brother, about Mary Brennan, about why you've been carrying guilt that isn't entirely yours to bear." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Levi had always suspected that Samuel Morrison knew more about his past than he'd let on, but they'd maintained the fiction of ignorance by mutual consent. Now it seemed that comfortable lie was about to crumble. "Some guilt is earned," Levi said quietly. "And some," the preacher replied, "is inherited from circumstances beyond our control. The question is whether you're ready to face the truth about what really happened 15 years ago, or whether you're going to let the weight of false responsibility destroy the good thing you've built here." Levi glanced toward the stairs that led to his living quarters, where Josie was getting ready for school. Everything he cared about in the world was contained in this building, and he'd known from the beginning that his past would eventually come calling. "Tell me," he said simply, And Preacher Morrison began to speak of things that had been buried for 15 years, of choices made and consequences faced, of how sometimes redemption required not just acknowledging your sins, but understanding which sins were actually yours to bear. Preacher Morrison's leather-bound Bible sat open on the workbench between them, its pages yellowed with age and use. On the inside cover, written in careful script, was a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in Millbrook for over a decade. Ezra. "Morrison, your real name," the preacher said quietly, watching as Levi traced the familiar letters with one scarred finger. "The name my brother James wrote in here, the day you both decided to head west and make your fortunes." Levi, Ezra, closed his eyes against the flood of memories that threatened to overwhelm him. "He was supposed to come with me to Colorado. We were going to start a ranch, build something honest and lasting. Instead, I convinced him to take one job first. One quick robbery to give us the capital we needed. The bank in Silver Creek," Samuel Morrison said, his voice heavy with old sorrow. "The job that went wrong. Everything went wrong." The words came out harsh and bitter. "We were supposed to be in and out with no one hurt. Just take the money and disappear. But there was a guard, and James—" "He froze when the shooting started, got caught in the crossfire." Samuel nodded slowly. "And you've been carrying the guilt for his death ever since, believing you killed him as surely as if you'd pulled the trigger yourself." "I did kill him," Levi said flatly. "If I hadn't talked him into that job, he'd still be alive. Mary would have married him instead of settling for Thomas Brennan. They'd have had the life they planned together." Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, its edges worn soft with handling. "James wrote this the night before the robbery. He asked me to keep it, said if anything happened to him, I should make sure the truth was known." Levi stared at the letter as if it were a serpent. "I don't need to read my friend's last words to know what I did." "Yes," Samuel said firmly, "you do. Because what you think you know and what actually happened are two different things." With reluctant hands, Levi unfolded the letter and began to read his dead friend's careful script. "Sam, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I won't be coming home. I want you to know that what we're doing tomorrow, it's not Ezra's fault. I talked him into it, not the other way around. I've been gambling, Sam. Bad. I owe money to people who don't wait for payment, and they've threatened to hurt Mary if I don't pay up soon. Ezra doesn't know. He thinks we're doing this to fund our ranch, but really, I'm doing it to save the woman I love. If something happens to me, don't let him carry blame. That belongs to me. And please, watch over Mary. She deserves better than the mess I've made of things. Your brother James." The letter fell from Levi's nerveless fingers. 15 years of guilt and self-recrimination crumbled in the space of a few sentences. James hadn't been the innocent friend led astray. He'd been a desperate man trying to save the woman he loved from the consequences of his own mistakes. "He never told me," Levi whispered. "All those weeks of planning, and he never said a word about the gambling debts." "James was proud," Samuel said gently, "and ashamed. He didn't want anyone to know how far he'd fallen. But Mary, she kept his picture all those years. She loved him. She did. But she also understood that he made choices that led to his own destruction. After he died, she grieved for the man he was and the life they might have had. But she didn't blame you for his death. She blamed the gambling and the desperation that drove him to make increasingly dangerous decisions." Levi sank onto the workstool, his large frame seeming to fold in on itself as the weight of misplaced guilt finally lifted. For 15 years, he'd carried responsibility for his friend's death, had shaped his entire life around the belief that he'd destroyed an innocent man's future. To learn now that James had been fighting his own demons, that the robbery had been James's idea born of his own desperation, it changed everything. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked. "Because you weren't ready to hear it. Guilt can become a kind of armor, Ezra. It protects us from having to risk being hurt again. As long as you believed you deserved nothing good, you couldn't." Be disappointed when good things were taken away. The truth of those words hit harder than any physical blow. Samuel was right. He'd built his entire adult life around the belief that he didn't deserve happiness or redemption. It had been easier to live in exile than to risk building something that might be destroyed. But now, Samuel continued, you have something worth fighting for. And that means you need to stop hiding behind old guilt and start facing the real challenges ahead. As if summoned by his words, Martha Flynn appeared in the doorway of the shop, her face flushed with exertion and alarm. Levi, you need to know, Thomas. Brennan is back. He's brought a sheriff and some kind of court order. They're at Dr. Walsh's office now, demanding that Josie be turned over to him immediately. The peaceful moment of revelation shattered like glass. Levi was on his feet instantly, his mind racing through possibilities and preparations. He'd known this moment would come, but knowing and being ready were different things entirely. What kind of court order? Samuel asked. I don't know the legal details, Martha replied, but he's claiming that Levi has no legal right to keep the child, and that as her closest blood relative, he has prior claim to guardianship. Where is Josie now? Levi's voice was carefully controlled, but Samuel could see the tension in every line of his body. Still at school. Mrs. Henderson is keeping her there until we figure out what to do. Levi moved toward the door, but Samuel caught his arm. Wait, you can't just storm over there and settle this with your fists. That's exactly what they're expecting you to do. Then, what do you suggest? The old Levi, the outlaw who'd solved problems with violence, was very close to the surface now, held back only by years of hard-won self-control. We fight this the right way, Samuel said firmly, with law and community support, and the truth about who you really are now. Martha had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. The pieces of the puzzle that had been Levi Cutter were finally falling into place. The guilt he carried, the way he'd isolated himself, the careful control he maintained over every aspect of his life. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I need to tell you both. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small, worn daguerreotype, a photograph of a young man in a suit, smiling confidently at the camera. It was the same face that had looked out from James Morrison's side of the locket, but this photograph was different. Older, more formal. This is my father, Martha said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. He was the bank guard who died in Silver Creek 15 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Levi stared at the photograph, then at Martha, his mind struggling to process this new revelation. The woman who'd been watching him with suspicion, who'd questioned his fitness to care for Josie, who'd become an unlikely ally in their small community. She was the daughter of the man whose death had haunted him for 15 years. You knew, he said, and it wasn't a question. I've known from the day you arrived in Millbrook, Martha confirmed. I recognized you from the wanted posters, from the descriptions the sheriff gave after the robbery. I've been waiting 15 years for you to come back so I could... She paused, struggling with emotions she'd kept buried for so long. So I could make you pay for what you took from me. Martha, Samuel said gently, but she held up a hand to stop him. Let me finish. I've spent 15 years planning what I would do when I found the men responsible for my father's death. I've carried hate like a canker in my chest, fed it and nurtured it until it became the center of who I was. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how you care for that child, seeing how you've tried to build something good from the wreckage of your past. Her voice broke slightly. I don't know what to do with all this anger anymore. Outside, the sound of approaching horses could be heard on Main Street. Thomas Brennan was coming, and with him, the reckoning that would determine not just Josie's future, but whether redemption was possible for any of them. What I do know, Martha continued, her voice growing stronger, is that tearing apart what you've built with Josie won't bring my father back, and that child needs you more than my need for vengeance. The three of them stood in the forge, surrounded by the tools of honest labor and the weight of 15 years of secrets as the sound of horses grew closer. Everything they'd built, Everything they'd hoped for was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. The confrontation everyone had been dreading began not with shouting or violence, but with the quiet rustle of legal papers being unfolded on Dr. Walsh's examination table. Thomas Brennan had arrived with Sheriff Coleman from the county seat, and a thin, nervous man who introduced himself as a court clerk. The sheriff was a weathered professional who seemed uncomfortable with the situation, while the clerk kept glancing around as if expecting trouble to materialize from the shadows. "The matter is quite simple," Thomas was saying as Levi, Samuel, and Martha entered the office. "I have a court order granting me immediate custody of my niece. Mr. Cutter has no legal standing whatsoever, and this charade has gone on long enough." Josie sat in a chair beside Dr. Walsh's desk, her small hands folded in her lap and her face set in the carefully controlled expression she'd learned during her months of being passed from household to household. She looked up when Levi entered, and some of the tension left her shoulders, but she didn't speak. "Mr. Brennan," Dr. Walsh said diplomatically, "perhaps we should discuss the child's wishes in this matter. Josie has been quite clear about her preferences." "A child's preferences are irrelevant," Thomas snapped. "The law is quite clear about the primacy of blood relationships in custody matters." Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, now that's not entirely accurate, Mr. Brennan. The territorial courts have broad discretion in matters of child welfare, and they're supposed to consider what's in the best interests of the child." "And surely," Thomas replied with forced patience, "it's in her best interests to be raised by family rather than by a stranger with questionable character and no resources." Questionable character. Levi's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. Thomas smiled with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Come now, Mr. Cutter. Did you really think your past would remain hidden forever? I've done my research. I know exactly who you are and what you've done." He reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of papers. Wanted posters, newspaper clippings, official reports. The evidence of Levi's outlaw years spread across the examination table like accusations made manifest. "Ezra Morrison," Thomas read from one of the posters, "wanted for bank robbery and murder. Last seen heading west from Silver Creek, Colorado territory. Reward of $500 for information leading to his capture." Josie's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. She stared at the papers, then at Levi, her young mind struggling to reconcile the man she knew with the criminal described in the official documents. "That's not who I am now," Levi said simply, "isn't it?" Thomas's voice was triumphant. "A man doesn't change his nature, Mr. Cutter, or should I say, Mr. Morrison. You're a killer and a thief, and I'll be damned if I'll let my brother's daughter be raised by such a man." Martha Flynn had been standing quietly near the door, listening to this exchange with an expression that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. Now she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Brennan," she said calmly, "before you continue with your accusations, there's something you should know about my relationship to this matter." Thomas turned to her with barely concealed irritation. "Miss Flynn, I hardly think your opinions are relevant to—" "My father was Robert Flynn," Martha interrupted, her voice steady and clear. "He was the bank guard who died in the Silver Creek robbery 15 years ago." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that touched everyone present. Thomas's mouth fell open, the sheriff straightened with sudden interest, and Dr. Walsh looked between Martha and Levi with dawning understanding. "Your father?" Thomas stammered. "But then you, of all people, should want to see justice done. You should want this man punished for what he took from you." Martha reached into her reticule and withdrew a small object wrapped in black silk. She unfolded the fabric carefully, revealing a blood-stained bandana, faded with age, but still bearing the distinctive pattern that had been described in the robbery reports. "This belonged to my father," she said quietly. "It was among his personal effects returned to me after his death. For 15 years, I've kept it as a reminder of what was taken from me. Josie was staring at the bandana with growing horror, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was being revealed. The man she'd chosen as family, the man she'd trusted with her future, was connected to violence and death in ways she'd never imagined. "But here's what you don't know, Mr. Brennan," Martha continued, her voice gaining strength. "What none of us knew until very recently. My father didn't die because of Ezra Morrison. He died because he chose to be a hero." She turned to face Levi directly, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've spent years hating you for destroying my family. I moved to this town because I knew you were here. I've watched you and waited and planned how I would make you pay for what you took from me." "Martha," Samuel Morrison said gently, but she shook her head. "No, let me finish. I need to say this." She looked around the room, taking in all the faces focused on her with rapt attention. "3 days ago, I received a letter from my father's partner at the bank. He's been carrying guilt for 15 years, just like Ezra has, and he finally decided to tell the truth about what really happened that day." She withdrew a folded letter from her reticule and began to read in a voice that trembled slightly but never wavered. "Dear Miss Flynn, I hope you can forgive an old man's cowardice in waiting so long to tell you this, but I thought you should know the truth about your father's death. When the robbers entered the bank that day, your father wasn't on duty. He was there on his own time, trying to talk me out of gambling away my children's inheritance. When the shooting started, he didn't have to get involved. He could have stayed hidden behind the counter and waited for it to be over. But when he saw that one of the robbers was just a boy, barely 20 years old and clearly terrified, he tried to step between that boy and the crossfire. Your father died trying to save the life of someone who was technically his enemy. That's the kind of man he was, and that's how he should be remembered." Martha's voice broke on the last words, and she stood there, holding the letter with hands that shook slightly. "My father chose to die protecting someone else's child, even someone who was technically his enemy. He died being exactly the man he'd raised me to be." The silence that followed was profound. Even Thomas Brennan seemed temporarily robbed of speech, his carefully constructed case suddenly complicated by nuances he hadn't anticipated. "So you see," Martha said, addressing the room but looking directly at Levi, "I've been carrying the wrong burden all these years. I thought I needed justice for my father's death, but what I really needed was to understand that he died the way he lived, protecting people who needed protecting." She walked over to where Josie sat, still clutching the wooden horse Levi had carved for her. "And that's exactly what Ezra Morrison is doing now. He's protecting a child who needs protecting, just like my father tried to protect him all those years ago." Thomas Brennan found his voice at last, his face flushed with anger and frustration. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fundamental facts. This man is a wanted criminal, and my niece deserves better than to be raised by someone with blood on his hands." "Whose blood?" Martha asked quietly. "Because according to every witness report I've been able to find, Ezra Morrison never fired a shot during that robbery. He was there, yes, he was part of the plan that went wrong. But he didn't kill anyone, Mr. Brennan. The only deaths that day were caused by crossfire between the bank guards and a third robber who panicked and started shooting." She turned back to Levi, holding out the blood-stained bandana. "I've been carrying this for 15 years, waiting for the day I could use it to destroy you. But I think my father would want me to give it to you instead. Not as evidence of guilt, but as proof that sometimes good people make bad choices, and sometimes bad situations create opportunities for redemption." Levi looked at the bandana, then at Martha's face, seeing in her expression something he'd never dared hope for, not just forgiveness, but understanding. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the piece of fabric that represented 15 years of guilt and sorrow. "Thank you," he said simply, and in those 2 words was a lifetime of gratitude for the gift she'd just given him. Thomas Brennan looked around the room, seeing his carefully laid plans crumbling in the face of testimony. He'd never anticipated, but he wasn't finished yet, even if we accept Miss Flynn's interpretation of events, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. The fact remains that Josephine is my blood relative, and I have both the legal right and the financial means to provide for her properly. What can a blacksmith possibly offer her that I cannot? It was Josie herself who answered, her young voice cutting through the adult arguments with startling clarity. A family, she said simply. He can offer me a family that wants me for myself, not for my inheritance. Thomas's face went white, then red with fury. In trying to discredit Levi, he'd revealed more about his own motivations than he'd intended. And now, surrounded by witnesses who'd heard Martha Flynn's testimony about redemption and sacrifice, he found himself facing a battle he hadn't expected to fight. The formal custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving both sides 3 days to prepare their cases. Thomas Brennan departed for the county seat, with promises to return with additional legal documentation and character witnesses, while Levi found himself facing the most important battle of his life, with nothing but the truth and the support of a community that was slowly beginning to understand who he really was. On Saturday morning, Josie sat at the small table in their room above the forge, carefully writing what would become the most important letter of her young life. Her tongue peeked out slightly as she concentrated, forming each word with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that words could change everything. "What are you writing?" Levi asked, pausing in his preparations for the hearing. He'd been reviewing every legal document Dr. Walsh had been able to find, trying to understand the complexities of territorial custody law. "A letter to the judge," Josie replied without looking up from her work. "Miss Flynn said sometimes grown-ups make better decisions when they understand how children really feel about things." Levi sat down across from her, watching as she worked. Her small hand moved carefully across the paper, pausing occasionally to think about the right words. The sight of her, bent over her writing, so serious and determined, filled him with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "What are you telling him?" he asked gently. Josie looked up, her brown eyes serious beyond her years. "I'm telling him about what family really means, about how you don't have to share blood to share love, about how you've taught me that making mistakes doesn't mean you can't be a good person." The simple wisdom of her words hit Levi like a physical blow. In 3 days, she'd absorbed the revelations about his past, processed the complexity of adult motivations and legal maneuvering, and emerged with a clarity that put most adults to shame. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "A little," she admitted, "but not of you. I'm afraid they won't understand that some families are chosen instead of given." That evening, Martha Flynn appeared at their door with a bundle of documents and a determined expression. She'd spent the day researching territorial law and gathering statements from townspeople who'd witnessed Levi's character over the past 12 years. "I've spoken to everyone," she announced, settling herself at their small table. "Mrs. Henderson, the school teacher, even old Mr. Patterson, who's never said a kind word about anyone in his life. They're all willing to testify about the changes they've seen in you, about how you've cared for Josie." Levi studied the papers she'd assembled, character references, testimonials, even a financial statement showing that his blacksmith business was profitable enough to support a child comfortably. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes thoughtful. "Because I've spent 15 years learning to hate, and I'm tired of it. Because my father died trying to protect someone, and I think he'd want me to do the same. And because—" She paused, struggling with emotions she'd kept buried for too long. "Because watching you with Josie has shown me what my father was really fighting for that day. He wasn't just protecting a scared young man. He was protecting the possibility that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us forever." Sunday brought an unexpected visitor, Preacher Morrison's wife, Rebecca, accompanied by several other women from the community. They carried baskets of food and bundles of clothing, and their presence transformed the sparse room above the forge into something that felt like a gathering of family. "We wanted you to know," Rebecca said, as the women bustled about organizing Josie's few possessions and adding small touches of comfort to the room, "that you're not facing this alone. Whatever happens tomorrow, this child has a community that cares about her welfare." Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, knelt down to Josie's eye level. "You've been one of my best students," she said warmly. "Curious, hard-working, kind to the other children. Any judge would be lucky to have you explain to him what makes a good home." As the women worked, they shared stories about Levi that surprised even him. Kindnesses he'd forgotten, moments of consideration that had been noticed and appreciated even when he thought no one was watching. He learned that his practice of leaving extra firewood for elderly widows had been known throughout the community, that his refusal to charge full price for work done for struggling families had earned quiet respect, that his transformation from feared stranger to valued community member had been more complete than he'd realized. "You gave this town something it had lost," Martha said, as the women prepared to leave. "You gave us proof that people can choose to be better than their worst moments. Don't let Thomas Brennan's greed destroy that." That night, Levi lay awake listening to Josie's steady breathing from her small bed behind the partition. Tomorrow would determine whether they had a future together, whether the family they'd built from mutual need and growing love would be allowed to continue. He thought about the wanted poster that had haunted him for 15 years, now revealed to be less damning than he'd believed. He thought about Martha Flynn's father, who died trying to protect a stranger's son, and about James Morrison, whose own desperate choices had led to tragedy. He thought about redemption and second chances, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about what it meant to be worthy of a child's trust. Most of all, he thought about Josie, brave, wise, loyal Josie, who'd looked past his fears and reputation to see something worth loving. Tomorrow, he would have to prove to a judge that he was worthy of that love, that the man he'd become was more important than the man he'd been. Monday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of sharp autumn light that made everything seem more vivid and consequential. Levi dressed in his best clothes, a simple black suit that Martha had pressed for him, while Josie carefully folded the letter she'd written and tucked it into her coat pocket. "Whatever happens," Levi said as they prepared to leave for the courthouse, "I want you to know that these past weeks have been the best of my life. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Josie asked, looking up at him with those serious brown eyes. "A hope," he said simply. The courthouse was a modest building that served 3 counties, but it seemed imposing enough as they climbed the front steps. Thomas Brennan was already there with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Denver who looked like he'd never met a legal technicality he couldn't exploit. They'd also brought character witnesses of their own, businessmen who could speak to Thomas's financial stability and social standing. But as Levi and Josie entered the courtroom, they found it filling with familiar faces. Martha Flynn sat in the front row, flanked by Dr. Walsh and Preacher Morrison. Mrs. Henderson was there with her husband, along with the schoolteacher, the hotel proprietor, and nearly a dozen other Millbrook residents who'd made the journey to support their unlikely family. Judge Harrison was an elderly man with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years listening to human stories in all their complexity. He reviewed the papers before him with careful attention, then looked up at the assembled crowd with mild surprise. "This appears to be a rather well-attended custody hearing," he observed. "Mr. Brennan, I understand you're seeking custody of your niece on the basis of family relationship and superior financial resources." "That's correct, Your Honor," Thomas's lawyer replied smoothly. "Mr. Brennan can provide educational opportunities, social advantages, and financial security that a simple laborer cannot match. And, Mr. The judge consulted his papers. Mr. Morrison, you're opposing this petition based on your current guardianship arrangement and the child's expressed preferences. Yes, sir, Levi said simply. She's my family now, and I'm hers. Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Well then, let's hear what everyone has to say. What followed was a parade of testimony that painted two very different pictures of what was best for Josie's future. Thomas's witnesses spoke of financial advantages, educational opportunities, and the importance of maintaining family bloodlines. They painted a picture of a successful businessman who could provide material security and social status. But the witnesses from Millbrook told a different story. They spoke of daily kindnesses, of a man who'd transformed himself through honest work and genuine care for others. They described Josie's happiness, her growth, the way she'd blossomed under Levi's quiet guidance. Martha Flynn's testimony was particularly powerful. She spoke of her own journey from hatred to forgiveness, of understanding the difference between justice and vengeance, of recognizing that redemption was possible even for those who'd made terrible mistakes. Your Honor, she concluded, I lost my father 15 years ago because he believed people deserved second chances. I won't dishonor his memory by denying that same chance to the man who's proven worthy of it. When it was Josie's turn to speak, she walked to the front of the courtroom with the composure of someone much older. She handed her letter to the judge, then stood straight and tall as he read it aloud. Her words were simple but profound, speaking of love that wasn't dependent on blood or money, of the difference between being cared for and being cherished, of finding family in unexpected places. She talked about feeling safe and valued, about learning that mistakes didn't define a person's worth, about the difference between a house and a home. Some people think family has to do with being born to the same parents, she concluded. But I think family has to do with choosing to love each other every day, even when it's hard. Levi chose to love me when I had nothing to offer but trouble. That's the kind of family I want to belong to. As she returned to her seat beside Levi, the courtroom was utterly silent. Even Thomas Brennan's lawyer seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Harrison set down the letter and looked out at the assembled crowd, his weathered face thoughtful. This court will recess for 30 minutes while I consider all the testimony presented here today. As people filed out of the courtroom to wait in the hallway, Levi found himself surrounded by the community that had come to support him. But his attention was focused entirely on Josie, who slipped her small hand into his and squeezed gently. Whatever happens, she whispered, echoing his words from that morning, you'll always be my family. And in that moment, Levi understood that, regardless of what the judge decided, he'd already won the only victory that truly mattered. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison entered with the symbolic scales of justice weighing heavily in everyone's minds. The ornate bronze scales sat on his bench, their balanced plates representing the eternal struggle between law and mercy, past and present, justice and forgiveness. I have considered all the testimony presented today, the judge began, his voice carrying the authority of years spent making decisions that shaped lives. This case presents several unusual circumstances that require careful consideration. Thomas Brennan sat forward eagerly, confidence written across his features. His lawyer had assured him that blood relationship and financial superiority would carry the day, regardless of sentimental community support. Mr. Brennan, Judge Harrison continued, your claim to custody is based primarily on family relationship and your ability to provide material advantages. The court acknowledges these factors and recognizes their importance in determining a child's welfare. Thomas exchanged a satisfied glance with his attorney. This was proceeding exactly as they'd expected. However, the judge said, the single word dropping into the courtroom like a stone, the court must also consider the testimony regarding your motivations for seeking custody. The confidence in Thomas's expression flickered slightly. Your Honor, I'm not sure what you mean. Mr. Brennan, several witnesses have testified about your specific interest in your niece's inheritance. While the court doesn't question your legal right to pursue custody, it must consider whether that pursuit is motivated by the child's welfare or by financial considerations. Dr. Walsh had provided detailed testimony about Thomas's questions regarding Josie's inheritance during his first visit to Millbrook. The schoolteacher had testified about Thomas's dismissive attitude toward Josie's own wishes. Most damning had been his own words during the confrontation at Dr. Walsh's office when he'd let slip his knowledge of Josie's financial assets before anyone had mentioned them. "I assure the court," Thomas said quickly, "that my primary concern is my niece's welfare." "Mr. Brennan," Judge Harrison interrupted gently but firmly, "the court has heard testimony that suggests otherwise. Your immediate focus on the child's inheritance, your dismissal of her clearly expressed preferences, and your apparent lack of interest in her emotional well-being all raise questions about your suitability as a guardian." Thomas's lawyer leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, but the damage was already becoming apparent. The judge's attention had shifted to more fundamental questions than simple blood relationship. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "the court has heard extensive testimony about Mr. Morrison's character and his relationship with the child. While his past includes serious mistakes, the evidence suggests a genuine transformation and a commitment to the child's welfare that goes beyond legal obligation." Martha Flynn sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She testified about her own journey from vengeance to forgiveness, about recognizing redemption when she saw it. Her words had carried special weight precisely because she'd had every reason to oppose Levi and instead had chosen to support him. The testimony of Miss Flynn was particularly compelling, the judge noted. As the daughter of one of the victims of Mr. Morrison's past crimes, her assessment of his character carries considerable moral authority. Her testimony that her father died trying to protect others, and her recognition that Mr. Morrison is now engaged in that same protective endeavor, speaks to the possibility of genuine redemption. Josie sat perfectly still beside Levi, her small hand wrapped around the wooden horse he'd carved for her. She understood that adult decisions were being made about her future, but she also understood that she'd already spoken her truth as clearly as she could. "The court has also considered the child's own testimony," Judge Harrison said, picking up the letter Josie had written. "While children's preferences are not the sole determining factor in custody decisions, they carry significant weight, particularly when expressed with such clarity and maturity." He read several passages from the letter aloud, his voice carrying Josie's words about chosen family, about love that didn't depend on blood or money, about feeling safe and valued. The courtroom listened in complete silence as an 8-year-old girl's wisdom filled the space. "This court has seen many custody cases," Judge Harrison continued, "but rarely one where a child has expressed her preferences with such thoughtful consideration of what family truly means." Thomas Brennan was beginning to look genuinely worried. For the first time, his certainty about the outcome was crumbling as the judge systematically addressed each element of his case. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said, turning his attention to Levi, "your past includes serious crimes that cannot be overlooked. However, the testimony presented suggests that you have spent 15 years not merely hiding from your past, but actively working to become a better man." Levi stood when addressed, his bearing respectful but not subservient. "Yes, sir. I've tried to earn the right to a different life." "The community support for your guardianship is remarkable," Judge Harrison observed. "It suggests that your transformation has been recognized and accepted by those who know you best. That carries considerable weight in this court's consideration." The scales of justice seemed to hover in perfect balance as Judge Harrison prepared to render his decision. In one plate lay blood relationship, financial advantage, and social convention. In the other lay love, redemption, community support, and a child's own clear preference. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath as the judge prepared to announce his decision. The symbolic scales of justice seemed to tremble in the balance, weighing 15 years of redemption against the claims of blood and money. "This court," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of careful deliberation, "finds itself faced with a decision that goes to the heart of what we mean when we speak of family, redemption, and the best interests of a child." Thomas. Brennan's hands gripped the arms of his chair as he waited for vindication of his legal claims. His lawyer had assured him that precedent favored blood relatives, especially those with superior financial resources. "Mr. Brennan, while your relationship to the child and your financial stability are factors this court must consider, they are not the only factors, nor necessarily the most important ones." The judge's tone was measured, judicial. "The testimony presented raises serious questions about your motivations and your understanding of what this child truly needs." "Your Honor," Thomas's lawyer interjected, "surely the court recognizes that blood relationship creates both legal rights and moral obligations." "Counselor," Judge Harrison interrupted gently, "the court recognizes that blood creates opportunity for family, but it does not automatically create family itself. That requires something more." He turned his attention to the community representatives who filled the courtroom. "The testimony from Millbrook's residents has been extraordinary. It paints a picture of a man who has not merely reformed himself, but who has become a valued member of his community through years of consistent, honorable behavior." Martha Flynn felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. She'd spent 15 years preparing for vengeance, and instead had discovered the transformative power of forgiveness. Her testimony about choosing mercy over retribution had clearly resonated with the judge. "Miss Flynn's testimony was particularly moving," Judge Harrison continued. "Her decision to forgive rather than condemn, despite having every reason to seek revenge, demonstrates a wisdom that this court finds compelling. When the daughter of a victim speaks for redemption rather than punishment, it carries profound moral weight." Preacher Morrison nodded slightly, recognizing in the judge's words the same spiritual truth he'd been trying to convey to his congregation for years, that forgiveness was not weakness, but the strongest force for transformation in human experience. "Mr. Morrison," the judge addressed Levi directly, "your past cannot be erased. You participated in actions that led to loss of life and caused immeasurable pain to innocent families. However, the evidence suggests that you have spent 15 years not running from those consequences, but learning from them." Levi stood again, his bearing dignified despite the weight of judgment upon him. "Yes, sir. I've tried to become worthy of a second chance. The court finds that you have largely succeeded in that effort," Judge Harrison said, his words causing a ripple of relief through the Millbrook contingent. "Your commitment to honest work, your service to your community, and particularly your care for this child, suggest a genuine transformation that goes far beyond mere repentance." Josie squeezed the wooden horse tighter, understanding that the tide was turning in their favor, but afraid to hope too much. She'd learned that adults could change their minds, that promises could be broken, that security was a fragile thing. Most importantly, the judge continued, this court has carefully considered the child's own, clearly expressed wishes. Josephine Brennan has demonstrated remarkable maturity in articulating what family means to her and why she feels secure in her current placement. He picked up her letter again, his voice softening as he quoted her words. "Some people think family has to do with being born to the same parents, but I think family has to do with choosing to love each other every day, even when it's hard." This court finds that wisdom in those words that speaks to the very heart of what makes a family. Love, commitment, daily choice to care for one another. These are the foundations of family, not merely shared genetics or financial advantage. Thomas Brennan's face had gone ashen as he realized that his carefully constructed case was crumbling. His lawyer was frantically shuffling papers, looking for some procedural objection that might salvage their position. However, Judge Harrison said, and the word hung in the air like a sword, this court also recognizes that custody decisions have lasting consequences that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances. The courtroom tensed again, everyone wondering what condition or limitation might be attached to the decision. Therefore, this court grants permanent custody of Josephine Brennan to Ezra Morrison, with the following conditions. First, that appropriate legal documentation be filed to formalize the adoption. Second, that the child's inheritance be held in trust until she reaches majority, with Mr. Morrison as trustee, but with court oversight to ensure proper management. Relief flooded through the Millbrook residence, like water breaking through a dam. Martha Flynn openly wept, her tears washing away 15 years of carefully harbored grief and anger. Dr. Walsh nodded with satisfaction, while Preacher Morrison's lips moved in what was clearly a prayer of thanksgiving. Furthermore, the judge concluded, Mr. Brennan, while this court does not question your legal right to pursue custody, it does question your understanding of what this child truly needs. The court hopes that in time you might choose to be part of her extended family in a way that serves her interests rather than your own. Thomas sat in stunned silence, his dreams of easy wealth evaporating in the face of judicial wisdom that had seen through his motivations with uncomfortable clarity. As the gavel fell with finality, Josie launched herself into Levi's arms, and, for the first time in 15 years, Ezra Morrison, now legally Levi Cutter, father to Josie Brennan, allowed himself to believe that redemption was not just possible, but real. In that moment, a new family photograph was truly born, not captured on film, but written in the hearts of two people who had chosen each other when the world seemed determined to keep them apart. 6 months later, the spring morning air carried the sound of hammer striking anvil in a rhythm that had become as familiar to Millbrook as the church bells on Sunday. But now there was something different about the sound. A lightness, perhaps, or maybe just the knowledge that the work being done was no longer solitary. The new sign above the blacksmith shop swayed gently in the morning breeze. Cutter and daughter blacksmith, quality work, fair prices, all welcome. Josie had designed the lettering herself, practicing for weeks until she could paint each word with the careful precision her father had taught her to apply to metalwork. Inside the shop, Levi worked alongside his daughter, for that's what the adoption papers now legally declared her to be, as she shaped a delicate iron rose that would become part of a garden gate for Mrs. Henderson. At 10 years old, Josie had hands that seemed naturally suited to the forge, and an understanding of metal that impressed even her father. "The iron's telling you something," Levi said quietly as he watched her work. "Can you feel it?" Josie paused, her small hand still on the cooling metal. "It wants to curve more here," she said, indicating a section that looked perfectly adequate to most eyes. Like it's reaching for something, Levi smiled with the pride of a master craftsman watching a true apprentice discover her gift, then let it reach. The transformation in their lives had been gradual but profound. The legal adoption had been only the beginning. What followed was the daily work of becoming a real family, learning each other's habits and moods, building traditions and memories that would last a lifetime. Martha Flynn had become an unexpected but cherished part of their extended family circle. Her journey from vengeance to forgiveness had freed her to rediscover parts of herself that had been buried under 15 years of anger. She'd started visiting the shop regularly, sometimes helping with Josie's lessons in reading and arithmetic, sometimes just sitting and talking while they worked. "You know," she said one evening, as they shared dinner in the small room above the forge, "I never thought I'd say this, but my father would have liked you, Levi. He always believed people deserved second chances." "I think about him sometimes," Levi admitted. About what he tried to do that day. I wish I could have thanked him. You have thanked him, Martha replied gently. Every day you spend being the man he died trying to protect, you're thanking him. The relationship between Levi and the broader community had evolved as well. Where once there had been fear and suspicion, now there was respect and acceptance. People brought their work to the forge not just because it was convenient, but because they trusted the man who did it. Children no longer dared each other to run past the shop. Instead, they lingered hopefully, hoping to catch a glimpse of the wonderful things being created inside. Thomas Brennan had departed Millbrook the day after the custody hearing and had not been heard from since. The inheritance that had motivated his interest in Josie remained safely in trust, managed with court oversight and growing steadily for her future. She'd expressed no interest in the money, seeming to understand instinctively that the things that mattered most couldn't be purchased. Dr. Walsh had become something of a grandfather figure to Josie, teaching her about books and learning while Levi taught her about work and craft. She has the rarest kind of intelligence, he told Levi one afternoon, the kind that understands both how things work and why they matter. Preacher Morrison continued his monthly visits to the forge, but the conversations had changed. Where once he'd spoken carefully of forgiveness and redemption to a man who seemed unreachable, now he talked with a friend about the daily challenges and joys of family life. You've given this whole town something precious, he told Levi as they watched Josie demonstrate her latest creation to a group of admiring children. You've shown us what redemption looks like when it's lived out day by day. She did that, Levi corrected, nodding toward Josie. She believed in it before I did. Maybe, Samuel smiled, but you had to become worthy of that belief. As the seasons changed and their life together settled into comfortable rhythms, Levi found himself thinking less about the past and more about the future. There were plans to expand the shop, dreams of teaching Josie not just metalwork, but the business skills. She'd need to run her own enterprise someday if she chose. There were conversations about education, about travel, about all the possibilities that opened up when you had someone to share them with. Most evenings found them working together until the light faded, then sharing simple dinners and talking about their day. Josie would practice her letters while Levi sketched designs for new projects, both of them comfortable in the companionable silence that came from truly knowing another person. Do you ever miss your old life? Josie asked one evening as they prepared for bed. Before you had to worry about anyone but yourself? Levi considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him something important. No, he said finally. That wasn't really living. That was just existing. This is living. Even when I ask too many questions, even when I make mistakes with the metalwork, even when I have nightmares about Mama and Papa. Especially then, Levi said firmly, family isn't just for the easy times, Josie. It's for all the times. On this particular spring morning, as they worked side by side in the forge that had become the center of their shared life, a stranger approached the shop. He was a young man, perhaps 20, with the dusty clothes and hollow eyes of someone who'd been traveling hard roads for too long. Excuse me, he said hesitantly. I'm looking for work. Any kind of work. I can learn whatever needs learning. Levi studied the young man, seeing in his face the same desperate hope he'd once carried himself, the same need for a chance to prove that past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities. What's your name, son? He asked. Michael, the young man replied. Michael Carson. And before you ask, yes, I'm running from something, but I'm ready to run toward something better instead. Levi exchanged a glance with Josie, who nodded slightly. She'd learned to recognize the signs of someone who needed what they could offer. Not just work, but hope. Well, Michael Carson, Levi said, extending his hand. Welcome to Cutter and Daughter Blacksmith. Let's see what we can build together. As the spring morning continued around them, the sound of their work carried across Millbrook like a promise that redemption was possible, that families could be chosen as well as given, and that sometimes The hardest hearts really could break open at the sound of someone who needed them. The forge burned bright, the work continued, and in a small room above the shop, a wooden horse sat on a shelf beside a growing collection of carved animals, each one a reminder that beautiful things could be created by hands that had once known only destruction, and that love, once found, could transform everything it touched.